Hello and welcome to this presentation on the European Union's Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Action Plan. This presentation is part of a series developed by NEPCon under a project called Increasing Capacity of Civil Society Organizations and Small to Medium-Sized Enterprises to Implement FLEGT requirements. The project is funded by the European Union and implemented by NEPCon and SFMI, the Sustainable Forest Management Institute in Viet Nam. This presentation will begin by providing an introduction to what is most often referred to as the EU FLEGT Action Plan by looking at its aims, history, and components. The focus will be on two key components of the Action Plan. These are the EU Timber Regulation, which is a law that prohibits illegal timber from being placed on the EU market, and voluntary partnership agreements, which are bilateral agreements made between the EU and non-EU forest producer countries that aim to ensure that timber and timber products imported into the EU from partner countries are legal. An important requirement for a voluntary partnership agreement is what is called a timber legality assurance system. We will look at what this is in some detail. We will then explore how the EU Timber Regulation and voluntary partnership agreements are related and how they work together to achieve the aims of the EU FLEGT Action Plan. Finally, we will look at what legal timber is from the perspective of the European Union in both the EU Timber Regulation and voluntary partnership agreements. The EU FLEGT Action Plan is the European Union's commitment to addressing illegal logging. The plan recognizes that as one of the largest consumers of timber products in the world, the EU will be an important export market for illegal timber and will therefore have a role in encouraging illegal logging. The Action Plan therefore places a large emphasis on trade. The EU FLEGT Action Plan sets out measures to achieve three main aims. These are to prevent the import of illegal timber to the European Union, to improve the supply of legal timber, and to increase the demand for timber from responsibly managed forests. The long-term aim of the plan is that the world's forests are managed sustainably. The EU FLEGT Action Plan began to come about after the recognition of the environmental, social, and economic damage of illegal logging at the 1998 G8 summit. At this summit, the G8 foreign ministers launched an action plan on forests. One of the 5 issues it intended to address was illegal logging, and this really put illegal logging on the international agenda. Member countries of the G8 began attempting to address the issue by focusing on the roles that both producer and consumer countries play. In 2001, work of the East Asia Ministerial Conference on Forest Law Enforcement and Governance, held in Indonesia, highlighted the ways in which governments, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector had begun to work together to combat illegal logging. The European Commission began work on its action plan following this conference. In April 2002, the European Commission hosted an international workshop to discuss how the EU should combat illegal logging. It was attended by experts, representatives of forest-based industries, civil society, and other stakeholders from the main wood-producing and importing countries to contribute to the development of the action plan. Later in the same year, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, held in South Africa, the European Commission set out its commitment to the fight against illegal logging. Then, on the 21st of May 2003, the European Commission published its FLEGT Action Plan. The Action Plan was then adopted by the Council of the European Commission in October 2003. The EU FLEGT Action Plan focuses on 7 broad areas to achieve its aims. One of these is providing support to timber-producing countries to address illegal logging. This support includes financial and technical support, for example, to help build timber legality assurance systems and to increase the capacity of governments, businesses, and civil society. The action plan also promotes the trade of legal timber. This includes one of the key components of the plan, which is the development and implementation of voluntary partnership agreements between the European and non-EU timber producing countries. We will look at voluntary partnership agreements in more detail during this presentation. The action plan also focuses on the promotion of environmentally and socially beneficial public procurement policies of EU member states. This is because public infrastructure projects in the EU are some of the largest consumers of timber in Europe. Another component is the support of private sector initiatives to avoid sourcing illegal timber. This includes encouraging voluntary codes of conduct for private companies that source timber. The action plan also focuses on safeguarding financing and investment, and this includes encouraging financial institutions investing in the forest sector to develop due diligence procedures for managing environmental and social risks related to their investments. Sixth in the list, we have a focus on the use of existing or new legislation to support the action plan. Importantly, this includes what is known as the EU Timber Regulation. Like voluntary partnership agreements, this is a very important component of the EU FLEGT action plan, and it is one that we will look at more in this presentation. Finally, there are efforts to address the problem of conflict timber, which include supporting the development of an international definition of conflict timber and working to ensure EU development aid programs take account of the role of forests in conflicts. We will now look at the EU Timber Regulation and voluntary partnership agreements in more detail. Commonly known as the EU Timber Regulation, or EUTR, EU Regulation 995/2010 is a law that prohibits the placing of illegal timber and timber products on the European Union market. As stated on the previous slide, a key component of the EU FLEGT action plan was the use of existing or new legislation to support it. At the time the plan was developed and adopted, it was seen that new legislation would be needed to achieve its aims. Therefore, legislation was developed, and following revision and further development, the EUTR was eventually agreed upon and passed by the EU Parliament and Council in 2010. It came into force 3 years later, on the 3rd of March 2013. The EU Timber Regulation is legally binding on all EU member states. It applies to timber products produced with any of the EU member states, as well as products produced in other countries and then imported to the EU. In terms of the types of products, it applies to a wide range of timber and timber products, including solid wood products, flooring, plywood, and pulp and paper. Not included are recycled products, as well as printed papers such as books, magazines, and newspapers. The actual product scope can be amended if necessary, meaning that it could change in the future. The EUTR contains 3 key obligations. Firstly, it prohibits entities in Europe from placing illegally harvested timber and products derived from illegal timber on the EU market. Secondly, it requires entities placing timber on the EU market, referred to as operators, to conduct due diligence on the timber they are sourcing. The requirements are to obtain information on the products being imported and to take steps to assess and minimize the risk of those products being illegal. Thirdly, the regulation also contains requirements for traders that buy or sell timber already on the EU market. Traders must keep records of who they buy timber from and who they sell it to. Importantly, only products that carry a FLEGT license or a CITES permit or certificate automatically comply with the EUTR. When a product carries a valid FLEGT license or CITES permit or certificate, operators do not need to conduct due diligence for the risk that the product is illegal. This is something to remember for later when the presentation focuses on voluntary partnership agreements or VPAs. To provide more clarity on what placing on the market means and what operators and traders are, we will use this diagram. Placing material on the EU market means that the specific timber product must be physically present in the EU, either because it was harvested in an EU country or because it was imported to the EU from another country. EU operators are those who place timber products on the market for the first time. Traders, on the other hand, are entities that buy or sell timber and timber products already on the market. Traders will either buy timber from operators or from other traders. Here, we show all of the different entities involved in the enforcement of and compliance with the EUTR. At the top, the European Commission is responsible for monitoring the regulation's effective and uniform implementation by the member states. The EU member states are responsible for implementing and enforcing the EU timber regulation. They enact the penalties for non-compliance and designate what are called competent authorities. The tasks of competent authorities include carrying out checks on operators, traders, and monitoring organizations, and maintaining and communicating records of their actions. As stated on the previous slide, companies that place timber and timber products on the EU market for the first time are referred to as operators. The key obligation is that they conduct due diligence on the products that they are purchasing to ensure that there is negligible risk that the products are illegal. For this purpose, they must implement a due diligence system containing elements for obtaining information on the products, assessing the risk that they have been produced or traded illegally, and effectively mitigate any risk that is identified. They may engage monitoring organizations, which are private entities that develop operational due diligence systems that can be used by operators, or they may develop and implement their own due diligence system. Finally, as discussed on the previous slide, traders of material already on the EU market have obligations to maintain records of their purchases and sales. Moving on from the EU timber regulation, we will now introduce the other key component of the EU FLEGT action plan, voluntary partnership agreements. A voluntary partnership agreement, or VPA, is a bilateral trade agreement negotiated between the EU and a timber exporting country outside the EU. While it is voluntary for countries to enter into a VPA, once it is signed, the VPA is legally binding. The purpose of a VPA is to ensure that timber and timber products imported into the EU from a partner country comply with the laws of that country. Another aim is to help timber exporting countries stop illegal logging by improving regulation and governance of the forest sector. These improvements or reforms are identified by stakeholders as necessary to ensure that the VPA is credible. Ultimately, what is required is the development of systems to verify that timber exports to the EU are legal. To achieve the aims of a VPA, particularly to ensure that exported timber is legal, it is necessary to define legality in the country. To do this, the partner country must decide which parts of its legislative framework will apply to the definition. This definition is the first component of the main product of a VPA, a timber legality assurance system, which is a system for verifying the legality of timber exports. The development of the legality definition and timber legality assurance system happens through negotiations that take place in the partner country. The negotiations involve a deliberative consultation process that includes various stakeholders from government, the private sector, and civil society. The process of negotiating and implementing a VPA is different for each country, but follows 4 general steps. It's important to note that while the VPA itself is negotiated between the EU and the partner country, establishing a VPA also involves in-country negotiations and discussions between relevant stakeholders, including representatives from the private sector and civil society. The first phase is for preparation and allows timber-producing countries that are interested in a VPA to gain information from the EU and its partners to decide with stakeholders whether or not to enter into negotiations. A positive decision leads to the next phase, which comprises the formal negotiations. During the second phase, the contents of the VPA, which is mainly the timber legality assurance system to verify the legality of timber exports, must be discussed and decided upon. A requirement within this phase is that decisions made by the partner country have agreement from national stakeholders, which requires a consultation process for these stakeholders to provide input. In-country decisions are then discussed with the EU to eventually agree upon the contents of the VPA. The third stage is the ratification of the VPA by both the EU and the partner country and approval by the European Parliament. Ratification is the process of both parties formally giving consent to the agreement, making it officially valid. The partner country may start developing the systems agreed in the VPA before ratification if they did not exist already, and they can put in place the timber legality assurance system. An independent auditor is needed to check that the system operates correctly. The final phase is for licensing, where each shipment of timber or timber products from the partner country to the EU must be accompanied by a FLEGT license. The license states that the shipment is legal according to the requirements set out in the VPA. Shipments without licenses will be rejected at the EU border. Currently, 15 countries are either implementing or negotiating a VPA with the European Union. These countries are located in Africa, Asia and Pacific, and South America. Cameroon, Central African Republic, Ghana, Indonesia, Liberia, and Republic of Congo have all signed a VPA, and they are currently in the phase of implementing their agreements, including their timber legality assurance systems. The Côte d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Guyana, Honduras, Laos, Malaysia, Thailand, and Viet Nam are currently negotiating VPAs with the EU. Aside to these countries, another 15 are in contact with the EU and may begin negotiations. Here, we will begin discussing the main part of the VPA, called the Timber Legality Assurance System, or TLAS. The TLAS is designed to identify, monitor, and license legally produced timber to ensure that only legal timber is exported. Although the VPA is an agreement with the EU, the partner country may choose to set up a system that can be used to verify the legality of timber for other markets as well. Each country entering into a VPA designs and develops its own TLAS during VPA negotiations. The technical details of the TLAS are contained in the final VPA. A TLAS contains 5 elements. The first element is the definition of legal timber. This will include all relevant laws in the country that apply to timber from the forest all the way to the port where it is exported. The second element is a system to control the supply chain or the movement of timber from the forest to the port. Thirdly, a verification system is needed to ensure that laws are followed throughout the supply chain and that products are indeed correctly traced. If this can be verified and timber ready for export is legal, FLEGT licenses can be issued for individual export consignments. This is the fourth component. Finally, there needs to be an independent monitoring system for the whole TLAS. Here, we will look at these 5 components in a schematic diagram. Firstly, we just have a timber supply chain which goes from the forest to the point of export, where products are placed in a shipment or consignment. This is what the TLAS applies to. Our first component was the definition of legal timber, comprised by all relevant laws in the country that affect the timber supply chain. The second component is a system to trace timber products through the supply chain to the point of export and individual consignments. Third was a system for verifying that timber is indeed legal and has been traced through the supply chain so that FLEGT licenses can be issued, which was the fourth component. Finally, independent monitoring of the whole system is needed to ensure it functions as it is supposed to. We will now look at 2 example timber legality assurance systems which have been developed through VPA negotiations to better understand what a TLAS is in practice. The first one is from Indonesia. Indonesia's legality definition draws on Indonesia's laws and regulations on forestry, trade, environment, agriculture, and land ownership, as well as international treaties signed and ratified by the country. The definition is framed around a number of key principles of forest production and processing for different forest types. For each principle, a number of criteria, indicators, and verifiers have been identified to demonstrate and verify compliance. To control the supply chain, every node of the supply chain must be controlled and documented, and checks are carried out by officials to validate documents. Companies must record whether products are TLAS verified and apply appropriate systems to segregate timber between timber and timber products from verified sources from timber and timber products from other sources. Records distinguishing these sources must be maintained and made available to forestry officials that carry out tests between and within nodes of the supply chain. The verification system is based on a certification approach known as operator-based licensing. A number of accredited conformity assessment bodies audit the legality of the operations of timber producers, traders, processors, and exporters, as well as their supply chain controls. Companies that meet the requirements are certified for legality for a period of 3 years and are subject to surveillance audits at least once a year. After 3 years, the legality certificate expires and can be renewed subject to a renewal application and another audit. If exporters are audited to be compliant with relevant laws, they are supplied with an export license, which once the VPA is fully implemented will be a FLEGT license if the shipment is intended for the EU. To license shipments, the conformity assessment bodies check that 1. The company and all of its suppliers are holders of valid legality certificates, and 2. Reconcile the trade data between the various suppliers to the exporter in order to ensure that no unverified timber has entered the supply chain. If an exporter or one of its suppliers does not hold a valid legality certificate or is found to be in breach of the relevant regulations, a certificate or license will not be granted. Moving on to monitoring, the Indonesian TLAS includes 3 different types. Independent monitoring is carried out by civil society, including forestry NGOs, communities living in and around the forest, and individual Indonesian citizens to assess compliance of all entities with the relevant TLAS requirements, including accreditation standards and guidelines. Comprehensive evaluation is carried out by a multi-stakeholder team to review the Indonesian TLAS and identify gaps and possible system improvements as mandated by the Indonesian Ministry of Forestry. Finally, periodic evaluation exists to provide independent assurance that the TLAS is functioning as described. An independent evaluator uses the findings and recommendations of independent monitoring and comprehensive evaluation and produces reports with recommendations on measures to be undertaken to address gaps and system weaknesses identified by the evaluation. For a second example, we will look at Liberia. The legality definition sets out the core requirements for legislation applicable to the forest sector. It consists of 11 principles, each of which is divided into a number of criteria and indicators that represent the legal requirement that must be complied with. Each indicator has verifiers that are used for determining whether an organization complies with the legal requirements covered by the indicator. For control of the supply chain, a chain of custody system is applied from the forest to the point of export or sale on the domestic market. For each step of the supply chain, the chain of custody system outlines the responsibilities of organizations in terms of activities and data to be entered into a dedicated information system. It also outlines verification requirements for assessments and field inspections. Furthermore, the requirements for verification include data validation in the information system and reconciliation of data between different steps of the supply chain. Legality and chain of custody verification is the responsibility of a new department of Liberia's Forest Development Authority, the Liberia Verification Department. This department collaborates with others that are responsible for specific aspects of the forest sector legislation. Verification results shall be recorded in a data management system that allows immediate checks on whether an operator complies with the legality definition and chain of custody requirements. For issuing licenses for timber exports, another new department, the Liberia Licensing Department, is responsible. Exporters must apply for FLEGT licenses for each export consignment. The Licensing Department in turn requests verification from the Verification Department that the exporter and possible suppliers associated with the consignment comply with the legality definition and that the products originate from legal sources and have been entered into the chain of custody information system. If this is confirmed, the Licensing Department issues a FLEGT license. The Liberian TLAS is monitored with an independent audit system which has the objective of assessing whether the TLAS is functioning effectively, appropriately, and with credibility, and to identify potential weaknesses and risks in the structures and implementation of the system. Separately, there is a channel of communication for civil society organizations to provide the Liberia Verification Department and other relevant authorities with monitoring data on operators' compliance with TLAS requirements. We will now move on to how VPAs and the EUTR are related. As we discussed right at the beginning of this presentation, the EU Timber Regulation and Voluntary Partnership Agreements are both part of the EU FLEGT Action Plan. They work together to combat illegal logging and improve forest governance, focusing on the trade of timber to and within the European Union. Starting with the EUTR, we know that it applies to legal entities in Europe and it prohibits the placing of illegal timber on the EU market. It requires companies that are importing timber products to the EU to conduct due diligence, but importantly, and this is where the link to VPAs comes in, due diligence is not required if the products they are buying are accompanied by a FLEGT license. Products with a FLEGT license are considered to automatically comply with the EUTR. VPAs, on the other hand, are required for FLEGT licenses to be issued. As presented earlier, VPAs define and provide for a timber legality assurance system, which, when operational, allows FLEGT licenses to be issued for timber products that have been produced legally. The operational link, therefore, is FLEGT licenses. So in the first place, a country needs a VPA. This provides for a timber legality assurance system, which once fully operational, can issue FLEGT licenses for timber products that are verified to be legal. This is beneficial because products with a FLEGT license automatically comply with the EUTR. Continuing on, this slide demonstrates further how VPAs and the EUTR are related, but also how they differ when we look at the European Union and a VPA partner country. In terms of the main legal obligations for legal entities, those in Europe have to comply with the EUTR. Entities in VPA partner countries need to comply with the laws that are included in the definition of legality in the VPA and TLAS. When a VPA is signed, ratified, and FLEGT licenses can be issued, importers in the EU can simply purchase products that carry a FLEGT license. In the country that can issue those licenses, organizations can sell products with FLEGT licenses when the TLAS verifies that the products are legal. This is what we went through on the previous slide. In the absence of FLEGT licenses, operators in the EU must conduct due diligence on their supplies to manage the risk of those supplies being illegal. Organizations in VPA countries or any non-EU country where FLEGT licenses are not being issued will be requested by their buyers for evidence of legality and may be subject to audits to verify evidence. Here we will explore that last point further to better understand the practical implications of a country having a VPA and being able to issue FLEGT licenses or not. If a timber importer within the EU is buying a shipment of timber products from a seller in a country with a VPA and functioning TLAS that can issue FLEGT licenses, the importer will ask for the FLEGT license of that shipment. The FLEGT license is all that is required to comply with the EUTR. If a timber importer in the EU wants to import a shipment of timber products from a country without a VPA, FLEGT licenses won't be possible. To comply with the EUTR, the importer will have to conduct due diligence before it purchases the products. To do this, the importer needs information, so that rather than be able to supply a FLEGT license, the sellers in countries without a VPA will have to supply information and various individual documents to demonstrate legality. The importer may request another organization to conduct audits of its suppliers, or it may conduct the audits of the suppliers itself to ensure that there is a negligible risk of the products being illegal before it buys them. Given the focus on legal and illegal timber of the EUTR and VPAs, we will conclude this presentation with a brief look at how legality or illegality is defined by both initiatives. Starting with the EU Timber Regulation, the regulation defines legally harvested timber as that which is harvested in accordance with the applicable legislation in the country of harvest. The definition of illegal is essentially the exact opposite, with illegally harvested timber being that which is harvested in contravention of the applicable legislation in their country of harvest. The important thing here is the reference to the country of harvest. When the word applicable is used, it refers to the types of laws considered to be relevant to the forest sector and trade of products. Applicable laws are those that are covered by the following topics: the legal right to harvest, taxes and fees linked to harvesting, compliance with timber harvesting laws, respect for the tenure and use rights of third parties, and relevant trade and customs rules. Now, what is considered to be legal and illegal in a VPA? Legality is defined in the country, in the VPA itself, as the first component of the timber legality assurance system. The legality definition that is decided brings together the aspects of the country's laws for which the TLAS will seek evidence of compliance. The definition is decided by the partner country with stakeholder consensus from government, civil society, and the private sector. Through the process of developing the legality definition, it may be decided that some of the country's laws need to be revised, and this has happened in some VPA countries. Like the EUTR, the legality definition in the VPA must cover certain topics, from land use rights and forest management through the whole timber supply chain to export laws. With this second last slide, we simply list the next presentations in this series. The next two are on the EU Timber Regulation, where we will provide a lot more detail on the EUTR, and then on chain of custody. On the slide, we've also listed some links that contain useful official information on the EU FLEGT action plan and on VPAs and the EU Timber Regulation. Thank you for listening to this presentation. We hope it has been interesting and useful to you. This presentation has been developed by NEPCon as part of the project Increasing Capacity of Civil Society Organizations and Small to Medium-Sized Enterprises to Implement FLEGT requirements.